This topic is particularly relevant with the pending closure of the Joint Forces Command, or JFCOM. Ironically, the impetus for JFCOM was that landmark legislation on jointness, Goldwater-Nichols. Let me first take a step back in history. In a special message to Congress in 1958, President Dwight D. Eisenhower stated that separate ground, sea, and air warfare is gone forever. If ever again we should be involved in war, we will fight it in all elements, with all services, as one single concentrated effort. However, President Eisenhower's vision was not fully realized until the passage of Goldwater-Nichols in 1986. The operations in Iraq and Afghanistan have shown that the U.S. military indeed has made significant gains in joint operations, training, and doctrine. However, there are still areas impacting the readiness of our forces that need to be addressed. We still must develop jointness in the way we communicate, procure our weapon systems, and in our logistics processes and information systems. That once would have been the ongoing role of JFCOM. In announcing the closure of JFCOM, Secretary Gates said the U.S. military has largely embraced jointness as a matter of culture and practice, although we must always remain vigilant against backsliding on this front. In reality, it's my contention that we cannot simply focus on what we've achieved to date and try to avoid a backslide, but rather we must continue to advance joint concepts in terms of doctrine, training, and development of strategies and tactics, since each scenario we face in the future will call for joint operations, but potentially differing responses. For example, the growing military power of China and its potential threat to the Asia-Pacific region would call for a different joint response from U.S. military forces, possibly more focused on an air-sea operation than the current CENTCOM operations, which primarily are land-based. I would ask our witnesses their view on how we can be assured this forward look at jointness will happen without a body that has the authority to force that on the services. The Joint Staff has played the role of principal military advisor to our senior civilian leadership. Even if they develop the necessary concepts to further jointness, how will they be able to press the services into compliance? In a recent speech at the Air Force Academy, Secretary Gates said, "It's easier to be joint and talk joint when there's money to go around and a war to be won." He said, "It's much harder to do when tough choices have to be made within and between the military services, between what is ideal from a particular service perspective and what will get the job done, taking into account broader priorities and considerations." I agree with Secretary Gates in this regard. Resistant bureaucracies exist within every part of the executive branch, and the service departments within the Pentagon are no different. Another critical readiness factor is that of the role of joint force provider. Jointness dictates that the services operate within their core competencies and seek the expertise of the service whose skills lie in a particular competency, including training. In the new construct, it is unclear who will take on this responsibility, but in order to truly promote jointness, it cannot be given to one particular military service. Finally, the operations with our NATO allies pose another concern. An example of their importance to our security interests is being reinforced even as we sit here with the operations over Libya, which this committee heard about this morning. JFCOM provided several venues in which U.S. and allied forces could interact. That dynamic cannot help but change. Indeed, French Air Force General Stéphane Abriel, Supreme Allied Commander for Transformation, or ACT, in discussing the NATO role after the closure of JFCOM, told reporters that ACT has started looking at how we will replug into this much more distributed system. Joining us today to discuss these issues are three distinguished individuals. General Raymond Odierno, Commander of the U.S. Joint Forces Command. General Odierno most recently served as Commanding General for the multinational force Iraq, working jointly with our allies. He also has served in other senior joint positions in the Pentagon. These assignments have more than prepared him for ensuring that the military's focus remains on jointness even as JFCOM is disestablished. Vice Admiral William E. Gortney, Director of the Joint Staff. While primarily serving in senior Navy commands throughout his career, Admiral Gortney has stated that Goldwater-Nichols substantially helped his career. Now, as Director of the Joint Staff, Admiral Gortney is uniquely positioned to reinforce his personal commitment to jointness. And Dr. Andrew F. Krapinovich, President, Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments. Dr. Krapinovich is a well-known military expert and currently serves on the Joint Forces Command's Transformational Advisory Board. He has been involved with JFCOM since its beginning. Gentlemen, we thank you all for being here, and I now recognize my good friend, the ranking member, Ms. Perdello, for any remarks she may have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I know that the topic of today's hearing is very important to our chairman, so I will keep my remarks rather brief. First, I'd like to welcome Admiral Jointness. Thank you, and General Odinero. Thank you for testifying, and also Dr. Krepin-Evit. Is that correct? And I want to thank the General and the Admiral for their visit in my office yesterday. General, as you know, I must mention how proud I am of our Guam reservists and our National Guardsmen who served with you in Iraq. And thank you for taking good care of my men and women when they were serving there. We are all very proud of them back home. Today's hearing focuses on ensuring that jointness in the U.S. military operation continues and is enhanced to promote our readiness to respond to threats to national security. The passage of the Goldwater-Nichols Act in 1986 was a major step forward in the reorganization of the Department of Defense to enhance operational synergies across all the services. The first Gulf War proved that Goldwater-Nichols had made substantial improvements in joint operations, and to this day, the U.S. military continues to be the best prepared force to fight jointly. The total force concept of jointness is proven. It works, and it makes our military more ready and more capable. As we look to the future, it is important for both the Congress and the Department of Defense to ensure that our military can operate effectively in a joint environment. We must find ways to maximize organizational efficiencies, and we must ensure that we maintain our focus on core joint strengths such as training, doctrine, manpower sourcing, and simulation. I look forward today to hearing from our witnesses on how they will continue to maintain the strength of our total force and what steps are being taken to improve joint training requirements. I have expressed concerns about training requirements in past readiness hearings, so I am interested in understanding what steps are being taken to ensure more consistency in training requirements across all the services and how the Joint Staff would support Pacific Command in its efforts to address training in the Pacific as dictated in the Quadrennial Defense Review. So again, Mr. Chairman, and to the witnesses, I look forward to the testimony from our witnesses. Thank you.
Thank you for those remarks, Madeline. And as we discussed prior to the hearing, I ask unanimous consent that we dispense with the 5-minute rule for this hearing and depart from regular order so that members may ask questions during the course of the discussion. I think this will provide a roundtable type forum and will enhance the dialogue on these very important issues. Without objection, so ordered. Gentlemen, we appreciate you being here, and I want to just take a moment and tell you that our format's a little bit different than some of the subcommittees. We have probably, I think, one of the most bipartisan committees in Congress. We work very well together, and so what we do is try to ask our questions in a little more logical framework than you might see in some other subcommittees. The other thing I want to do is tell you how much we appreciate you being here. General, you've got a lot of stars on your shoulder. They weren't given to you. We know that you earned those, and we just respect that service, and we respect what you've done for our country and for you being here. Admiral, we appreciate your service, and I know that you're kind of new to the hearing circuit, and so we hope you have a good experience today, and thank you for being here. And Dr. Krepin-Evit, we thank you so much for your contribution to Jointness, and I don't do this very often, but I commend your book to anyone who wants to read it. It's just excellent, and I think it's a true eye-opener. The other thing I want to encourage you to do is this. This is not a gotcha time or moment. If there's anything that you just left out that you want to come back in and do, take the time you need to do it. One of the witnesses has completed something and you want to extrapolate on that, please feel free to do it. If you rethink something afterwards and you want to just come back or you didn't get all the time you need, let us know. We want you to be able to do that. So thank you all for being here. And with that, General, we'd love to have you start off. We are going to, just so you know, for the record, we've taken all your written remarks and we make them a part of the record. Don't feel like you have to regurgitate them to us, but if it feels more comfortable to do it, we're going to leave that up to you. And if you would take about 5 minutes or so each, and then we'll go into our questions. General?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Ms. Bordello, other distinguished members of the committee, thank you so much. I think it's an important topic we're here to discuss today. Obviously, readiness today and in the future of our joint force is key to us being successful in the future. I'd just like to go back to my time in Iraq, where from 2003, when I was a division commander, through my time as multinational Corps Iraq commander, to multinational Force Iraq, to U.S. Forces Iraq, I got to personally witness as a joint commander the growth that we had in our joint and multinational operations, whether it be from intelligence collection, whether it be from targeting, whether it be from joint staff operations. It increased exponentially. And I believe that's what the Secretary of Defense was talking about when this has become more routine. From 2003 to 2011, our ability to establish and routinely conduct joint operations has become much more routine. I think we've witnessed that in Afghanistan and Iraq. We've witnessed that in Libya. We've witnessed that in the Pacific during the crisis in Japan. And we've witnessed it in Haiti and other places. So forming joint task forces, understanding the roles and capabilities of the services is significantly improved. That said, it's something that we must continue to look at, improve, and have the processes in place so we can continue to modify and improve our joint force as we meet the many difficult challenges that we will face in the coming years. And I certainly recognize this as a former Joint Force commander. As I first got to Joint Forces Command, I had this in mind when I originally looked at what Joint Forces Command was doing. What was it doing to support the combatant commanders? What was it doing to support the services? What were the core functions that needed to remain so we could, most importantly, not only sustain, but improve our jointness in the future? And we identified some key core functions. One being, first and foremost, joint-enabled collective and individual training. Second, the continued development of joint concepts through lessons learned. Third, the development of joint doctrine. And finally, all of this underpinned by modeling, simulation, and experimentation. And those are the core functions that will remain as we move forward. And that will be the key for us in sustaining and continuing to improve our jointness. And in fact, I believe as we move forward, we're eliminating bureaucracy that was unnecessary and that I hope will streamline the process that will make us more responsive to the many complex challenges we have ahead. So I look forward to having a further discussion today about that. I appreciate your concerns, and I very much believe that this is an important conversation that we're having. So thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, General. Admiral, thank you for being here, and Mike's all yours.
Thank you, Chairman. Ms. Bordello, jointness is the philosophy that underpins the United States strategy and operational application of the military. And today's senior military officers are products of Goldwater-Nichols reform, and most service members have never experienced operations in anything but the joint environment. In fact, our young officers, 04 and below, and senior enlisted E7 and below, it's all they know as they raised their right hand 10 years ago, volunteered to serve their nation in time and war, and fight in joint operations. As the director of the Joint Staff, I see the focus on jointness in our service members every single day. In the last 10 years, 6 of the last 10 years, overseas at the operational and tactical level, in one of those capacities, working for the general here as his maritime commander. The chairman, by law and policy and intent, is charged with maintaining jointness. He does this now, and he'll continue to do it after JIFCOM is disestablished. In order to do so, we're establishing a 3-star J7 director on the Joint Staff, specifically charged with joint force development, and the pillars of joint force development were very well explained by the general here. Now, J7 partners today with JIFCOM in these endeavors and will execute them tomorrow in a flatter, more efficient, more responsive organization. In reality, this is less about a COCOM going away and more about DoD figuring out a better way to perform joint oversight and ensuring joint readiness, thereby providing a better value for the American taxpayer, and I look forward to taking your questions, sir.
Thank you, Admiral. Doctor?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Congressman Bordello. My testimony really addresses three questions. First, why was Joint Forces Command created in the first place? I happened to be on the ground floor of its creation. Back in 1997, I was serving on the National Defense Panel. We were tasked to look out 15 or 20 years into the future to try and get a handle on what kind of security challenges we would confront, quite frankly, in the decade we're entering now. Our conclusion was that we were in for a period of disruptive change, that we would be facing new and very different kinds of security challenges. And as we did that, we looked back to the past to say, well, how do military organizations that are confronted with disruptive change, how do they successfully navigate that? And we found in many instances it was through a period of deep thinking, where they put some of their best thinkers to work on what General Odierno said is concept development. You know, what is a way to deal with this new problem? And then second, war games, more recently simulations, and then ultimately field exercises to test out those ideas so that we were sure that we were buying, as sure as we could be, the right kind of equipment, developing the right kind of capabilities, and so on. Our idea was that these operations, as you said, Mr. Chairman, quoting President Eisenhower, were going to be inherently joint. So the services individually could not come up with the answers or the solutions to these problems. And then finally, the idea was there needed to be a senior officer that, in my terminology, spoke for the COCOM after next, the commander that would be in the field 5 to 8 to 10 years into the future. Because nobody really speaks for that person right now. We don't know who he is. He doesn't know who he is. So somebody's got to be there when we're setting the requirements for capabilities that, quite frankly, aren't going to be in place today, but will only be in place over time when that commander has to take the responsibility for his or her particular command. I think that concern has been validated over time. 1997, we had some perception of what might be emerging. Now I think it's much clearer. We have the Chinese and the Iranians developing what we call anti-access area denial capabilities that are designed to push us out of the Western Pacific and the Persian Gulf. We have the diffusion of guided weaponry to the point where there are concerns that even non-state entities like Hezbollah will get these weapons and create a new form of modern insurgency or irregular warfare. A situation where if Iran gets nuclear weapons, you'll have an inherently unstable nuclear balance in the Middle East between Iran and Israel. Concerns about Pakistan, who has 4 reactors either in production or underway to produce plutonium to make far more nuclear weapons than they can absorb locally. The issue of the prospective loss of assured access to space and cyberspace. We've already seen the Chinese take out satellites in low Earth orbit, and yet that's where we continue to put satellites into for the most part. And then the major issue of cyberspace. You know, these are all presenting us with strategic problems or military problems that we need answers to, that the Defense Department and the President need answers to decide if, in fact, these problems are soluble. If so, what kinds of capabilities and doctrine we're going to need. Or do we need to pursue an alternative strategy with all its implications for forces, force structure, doctrine, and equipment? Now, my second question is how well has Joint Forces Command accomplished this mission of representing the COCOM after next, of looking into the future and helping us position ourselves to anticipate what's coming as opposed to react to it? And my conclusion is not particularly well. There have been a number of reasons for this. And it hasn't been for a lack of hardworking people. It hasn't been for a lack of talented people. I think certainly one thing that's occurred is the consequences of 2 wars and the enormous demand signal that has placed on the command, and the obvious and logical conclusion that you've got to support the war we've got, but again, the need to balance that with preparing for the future. Second, resistance by the military services. Prospectively, when you engage in this process of discovery and identification of new ways of conducting operations, ultimately you're going to create winners and losers among and within the services, winners and losers among programs, and the services jealously guard their program of record and their responsibility for setting requirements. Third, I think, is a lack of top cover. I don't think it was ever particularly well understood, either by a series of defense secretaries or in some cases even the Joint Forces Command commander, as to what exactly this all meant in terms of joint concept development and experimentation. And that's based on my conversations with a number of them. Then there was the fact that the Commander Joint Forces Command was never really involved in setting requirements. No membership on the Joint Requirements Oversight Council, no membership on the Defense Acquisition Board. Then there was the fact that even though typically these kinds of major changes in doctrine and force structure take the better part of a decade, the Commander Joint Forces Command typically had a very short tenure, 2 years, 3 years. When in fact, if the job was being done well, he probably needed two concurrent 3-year command tours. And finally, the tendency in some cases to outsource thinking. The civilian support in the J9 shop almost became legendary not only down there but up here. Again, a lot of good people, but history indicates that in concept development you really need military professionals who are really expert in terms of strategy, development of operational concepts, and I don't think we ever got to that point with respect to J9. Third is this mission still important? I would argue it's more important now than ever. I don't oppose the disestablishment of Joint Forces Command, but I definitely feel as though this mission cannot afford to be an orphan any longer, that it's got to be given serious consideration. Otherwise, I think we're going to be continually surprised over the next 10 years at what our rivals and adversaries are doing to us, rather than being well prepared for it, anticipating it, and being in a position to deter aggression or coercion or respond effectively if that fails. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Doctor. I'm going to defer my questions until the end because I want to make sure our members get to ask all of theirs, and so I'm going to turn now to my colleague, the ranking member, Ms. Burdella.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Admiral, I have a question for you with regards to joint training. I understand that the services have made significant gains in developing new training opportunities using modeling and simulation tools. Further, I know these advances in training techniques have contributed to our efforts to help train our coalition partners around the world. What is the next step for the services to evolve further and share these cutting-edge training capabilities with each other in today's distributed environment? And the second part of the question is, how will the Joint Staff encourage the combatant commands and services to fully utilize new technologies to meet current future training requirements?
Ma'am, I think the answer to your first question is that the services are all finding that modeling and simulation are one of the best training values for the dollar spent. You can get, in particular areas, the best quality training that you can through a simulation. It does not fully replace live fire training, large exercise, but any time that you can work the simulation piece in there at the right level for the right cost, it's a very good return on investment. And on the Joint Staff, we're going to continue to do that. Modeling and simulation is one thing that is one of the tasks that is not going away with JIFCOM's disestablishment. We'll be using the same facility, but it will be reporting to the 3-star on the J7.
Thank you, Admiral. And General?
Ma'am, could I add something to that, please?
Yes, General. I'm sorry.
What I'd like to, your points are very good. And in fact, we just finished the most complex modeling simulation exercise that we've done, where we incorporated an exercise preparing units from Afghanistan. We included a German division out of Europe, a Marine division out of Camp Lejeune, and an Army division out of Fort Hood, Texas, all virtually, who were able to conduct an exercise preparing themselves to go to Afghanistan. It was run by Joint Forces Command. It was completely joint and multinational in every way. Our capability to do that type of exercises is going to remain in toto, in Suffolk, Virginia, in the Joint Warfighting Center, The only difference now is it will report directly to the Joint Staff J7. We think that's key. And then the modeling and concept and experimentation piece will be there together for the first time instead of separate. And being together, we hope that that will facilitate more coordination to look at future challenges that we'll have. That's the concept that we've put together for this.
Thank you, General. I have a question for you, General or Admiral. Can either of you comment on the success of the implementation of the new Joint Officer Management Program and the Joint Qualification System? Has the opportunities to gain joint credit through experience yielded a greater number of joint qualified officers, and are there any hiccups to this new process or unintended second or third order effects to the new requirements for military officers to endeavor to be fully joint qualified? Are there any legislative changes necessary to further refine the process for the active guard or reserve members?
I would say that the operational experience piece of getting joint experience has been fundamentally important, especially over this last 10 years, since many of our joint jobs have been, in fact, in operational deployed areas. And that has helped us significantly in getting credit for individuals who are actually performing on the ground joint tasks together. So I think that's gone well. We still have some education that has to be done internal to all the services to make sure the officers understand that they get the appropriate credit for what they're doing, and we're still working our way through that. Secondly, I would just say is I think we just went over the last hurdle because our operational trainers, specifically in Joint Forces Command, which I would consider probably the most joint job we have because they're responsible for training the joint force, was by legislation not included to be considered inherently joint. We have now corrected that. We're on our way to correcting that. So I think that's a very positive step forward.
Admiral?
And yes, ma'am, and that program is actually run through the Joint Staff today. And we have, since its inception, over 2,400 officers have been able to be joint qualified as a result of that, to include the active and the reserve. Before, the reserve were not able to use that to become joint qualified. We've seen no hurdles other than maybe an IT technology on database management, on how to do that and tracking. We've worked our way through that. We think it's a terrific program, and we want to expand it as much as we possibly can.
Good. Thank you. And, Mr. Chairman, I yield back, but I do have a couple of other questions later on.
And we'll come back to you after everybody else, Ms. Bordello, if that's okay. Gentleman from Nevada, Mr. Heck, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, gentlemen, for being here today and for your service. General, my time in Iraq happened to be during the 7 months that you were on hiatus in 2008, so we didn't cross paths, but I can attest to the jointness of the operation and am proud and honored as an Army guy to wear the first MEF patch as my right sleeve patch. And having spent some time in your neck of the woods when I was at Joint Forces Staff College undergoing my advanced joint professional military education. But I'd like first to follow up on the JQO issue raised by the ranking member. I can tell you that while there are more opportunities for reservists to get joint qualified, it is a very difficult process because of the number of billets that are on the JTMD and the JMD. And I'll just say that even though through the self-nominative process you're able to get the education and get some points for exercises and other education, it's extremely difficult for reservists, and I would hope that we open up other avenues for those in the Guard and the Reserve to get their JQO. Can you tell me what the plan is for the Joint Forces Unmanned Vehicle Management System, specifically the Unmanned Aircraft System of Excellence, the Center of Excellence out of Creech?
Congressman, initially the Joint Unmanned Aerial System Task Force is going to be sunsetting. The plan was for it to sunset in the end of 2012. We have moved that forward to the end of 2011. So the organization itself will sunset. But what will happen is the Joint Staff under the J8 is going to create individuals there to continue to have oversight of the service programs that continue on for not only the aerial but all of unmanned systems as we move forward. We think it's time to do that. We think we have the services focused in the right areas on this, and with the J8 oversight, we think that's appropriate for us to continue to monitor as we move forward.
So it'll be a J8 function for the Joint staff. Any idea on where is there going to be another center of excellence or something that's going to be stood up somewhere? Or is it going to
It'll actually be, it's going to be an 8 to 10 man cell stood up on the Joint staff in the J8 with the sole purpose of monitoring and overseeing the services in conducting both unmanned aerial and other unmanned systems.
So it's being pushed back out to the services to do the work with an oversight cell.
Right, that's right.
Okay, thank you. And I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Joe. Gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Kissel, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses. And I have to say, General Odierno, it's good to see you here in Washington. The last time I saw you was in Baghdad. One of the things when I was spending many years in business, it seemed like there were times when we were successful at things and things were going well, then someone higher up decided, well, you can do without this, you can do without that. Obviously, the decision's been made, and I do have great concerns about this jointness. I can remember, I believe it was the invasion of Grenada, with that famous story about somebody having to call Washington to speak to somebody at the Pentagon to call somebody else because there was no way to coordinate. We had a readiness hearing not long ago. We had members from the 4 branches of service in, and I asked them what's the biggest deficiency that they face. And 3 of the 4 branches said time for training. If that is the issue, where are we going to find time not only to train in the particular expertise of their service, but also time for the joint aspect of what we need to do? And will the lack of this position that will coordinate, how's that going to affect us? And General Admiral, if y'all could give me some thoughts, I'd appreciate it.
Sure. First, on the training side, I would just say what's happening now among all the services is they're training for the mission at hand. For example, in the Army, units getting ready to deploy to Iraq and Afghanistan, they're training in a joint concept to prepare themselves to operate on the specific contingency that they're able to do. And the other services are doing the same. So the concern is they don't have the time to train across the broad spectrum of missions that could come up under contingencies, and that's the concern with time. So what we've done is, with the time we have, we develop joint exercises, both at the highest level of command, whether it be the JTF itself, a division, a brigade, a group, a wing, a squadron, and we continue to get them incorporated into the joint training, as well as at the lowest levels, preparing them for the environment that they're going to operate in, a joint multinational environment. That's occurring. What's lacking is if they have to go do something else, and that's what they're not having the time to do, and that's the concern.
And Dr. Krpenovich, we've kind of left you out of the conversation here. So I want to get you back involved. And am I correct in opening remarks that you maybe don't agree that this is a decision we should be making and closing down the center?
As I said, I don't disagree with the decision to shut down Joint Forces Command. My primary concern is that the original mission for which it was established was never really accomplished by the command. I'm hoping that in the wake of its disestablishment, this mission will find a true home and true support. If you look at Joint Forces Command, and especially in terms of the missions of Joint Force Trainer, Joint Force Provider, those were missions initially assigned to Atlantic Command in 1993. When Joint Forces Command was created in 1999, the Futures mission was the add-on. That was the purpose for disestablishing Atlantic Command. But again, I'm sorry to say that despite the efforts of many good people, we still haven't gotten traction on preparing for what some people call the next big thing.
If I could just add to that, I don't disagree with what Dr. Krpenovich is saying. In fact, as we went through this review, we found that there were some core functions that I believe were not being done to the best of our abilities. So through this, so it's not only a disestablishment of the four-star headquarters, but it's actually a reorganization of how we want to better impact our joint force. And we're reorganizing ourselves, in my mind, so we gain better synchronization and integration. And we're doing it by building a center which will remain in Norfolk, which has been large investment put in there for modeling, simulation, and experimentation for us to look to the future as well as today and better synchronize what we're doing between concept development, doctrine, and our training as we look ahead. So that's the intent. So it's not going away. It's the four-star piece of it and the four-star proponent that's going away, but many of the key pieces will remain and be reorganized to address some of the problems, actually, that Dr. Krepanevich has brought up in his testimony. Now, we'll have to continue to review this over time to ensure that we are, in fact, doing the things we think we should be doing, and that'll be something we have to pay attention to, and will be up to the chairman, vice chairman, and the J7 to do those reviews as we move forward.
Okay, thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Kissel. Gentleman from New York, Mr. Gibson, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman, and appreciate the distinguished panel being here today. Discussion has been productive. The first one is just a process question. With the disestablishment of JFCOM, will the remaining command have any role in the global force management process?
What will happen is the expertise that we've built in Norfolk to do global force management will remain. It will report to it will become part of the J3 of the Joint Staff. And as they do global force management, they will then do that, and the J3 will then bring it to the Secretary of Defense, who actually has the authority to make the decisions on global force management through advisement by the chairman. And that will continue.
Okay, very well. And just to really reinforce some of the comments made earlier, I think what is clear with operations in Iraq and Afghanistan that at the individual leader and collective level across the force, there's great confidence, joint confidence in the formations, particularly in counterinsurgency operations. But I'd like to take this point that General Odierno made moments ago to another level about some of the risk we're carrying, about full spectrum operations. In my last assignment, I led the Army's component of the Global Response Force. And it was my assessment that given the ongoing operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, we were accepting a great deal of risk in our Global Response Force. And that was understandable given the decision that higher level commanders had to make. But going forward, particularly when we look at the budget and what's forecasted in terms of troop levels and assumptions with regard to Afghanistan when we're going to complete our combat tasks there, how is that going to impact Joint Forces Command and the Joint Staff as they look to try to reduce the risk in terms of our joint readiness? I would point to as not just the joint forcible entry exercises that we did, but also the deployment that we did to Haiti. Certainly Herculean effort done by the GRF, but we trickled in. We really didn't have enough sorties to get the force on the ground fast enough, and that was some trade-offs based on other theaters. But as we look at full spectrum, how are we, from the training perspective, going to manage that risk? And largely, we're probably talking about staff tasks here, so we're talking about simulations, and how are we going to ensure we have the cadence, repetition and cadence to build that competency? And then from the management of the readiness side, how are we going to track that and ensure that we're communicating the risk to the President and to the Secretary of Defense?
I think that, first off, we do that on a quite regular basis, understanding where our shortfalls are, what we can and can't do. And I think the chairman takes a lot of time in making sure that both the Secretary of Defense and the President understands what those risks are. You know, we don't know the unknown. I mean, I think the thought process is with us finishing our commitment in Iraq here at the end of the year, that will allow us to start to do some of the things we have not been able to do. But I hesitate to say that because the unknown is the unknown, and we never know what other commitments could come up. But I think the thought process across the force is that we have to start focusing on other areas. And Dr. Krebin mentioned China. And that's an important one, and what our role would be there and how we prepare ourselves. He also mentioned anti-access. That's something that we're really starting to take a hard look at now and how we're going to do that. So those are the kind of things we absolutely have to stay focused on and prepare our forces so they're prepared to respond. But again, time is an issue, and the amount of our commitment of our forces and how long that remains will always be an issue in whether we're able to meet these other demands that you've mentioned.
I'd also like to add, sir, that not 100% of the force is focused on Iraq and Afghanistan. Not 100% of the force owns the same amount of risk on being able to fight through the full spectrum of conflict. So you'll see a large majority of your Navy and your Air Force that are focused on the high-end war, while we're accepting risk and because of the capacity and the near-term fight for the Army and the Marine Corps. And as we draw down, you're going to see that shift again, because the service chiefs clearly recognize that need to be able to full spectrum ops.
Thank you. And as we manage this risk and as we develop competency, I also envision this is going to help our diplomats and really the administration as they work to advance our interests. When we can demonstrate a capability to deploy joint forcible entry exercise forces, followed by early entry forces, followed by campaign forces and sustainment forces, even in an exercise, I think that'll be more meaningful when we deal with situations perhaps in Iran, Korea, China. As you know, I mean, really deterrence is about capability and will. If you got will and no capability, you don't have deterrence, and vice versa, if you've got capability and no will. So I see this piece of this, restoring the joint readiness to a more acceptable level of risk, is actually going to help our country manage our overall risk and advance our interests in the out years. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Doctor, did you have a response that you wanted to make to that, or did I misread?
Just a brief one. Again, I think the issue here is the responsibility to manage near-term and long-term risk. What you're trying to do is mitigate or minimize the overall risk in your situation. And so in terms of, as General Odierno said, we've got a lot of stress on the force right now. Somebody has to speak up and say, well, we're going to have even more stress on the force down the road if we don't do certain things now to prepare. And so, you mentioned a particular exercise about forcible entry. Well, a big part of the issue of anti-access area denial is missile forces holding at risk access to forward bases, ships being vulnerable in the littoral. And I'll just give you a quick example. There was one large exercise that Joint Forces Command did conduct in 2002. It was called Millennium Challenge 2002. And in that exercise, the enemy was a country similar to Iran. And we found that, number one, operating our fleet in the Persian Gulf was a high-risk operation. A significant part of the fleet was either damaged or destroyed. Number two, at the time, the Army had a concept where it said we need to deploy a brigade forward in 96 hours. Well, we got the brigade forward, but then how do you sustain it forward? That was an issue that developed. Third was the enemy, in this case, decided to operate like the Serbians and not turn on their radars like they didn't do in 1999. So we were restricted to operating with our stealth aircraft, and the solution to that was to tell these guys to turn their radars back on. So there are a number of lessons that came out of that said, look, toward the end of even the 2000 aughts, if you're thinking about projecting power in the Persian Gulf, even against a minor adversary, given the geography, you were going to confront a number of different problems. And in my estimation, that exercise was a success because it identified areas where we were doing well and areas where we needed to think about in terms of how we need to operate in the future. Unfortunately, those lessons, I think, were left on the cutting room floor. Not quite sure why, but you can begin to see now, Congresswoman Bordallo, Guam, Anderson. We're piling stuff into Guam. Somebody said it's going to flip over one of these days. There's so much military capability. I know. But the point is, this isn't lost on the Chinese. And if you look at the ballistic missiles they're building, the greater and greater percentage of them are longer and longer range. I mean, Guam and Anderson have a gigantic crosshairs, on them right now. Well, what are we going to do about that? Are we just going to pile targets into Anderson so the Chinese can intimidate us when they conduct, some kind of military operation or coercion in the Western Pacific? We've got ships in the fleet that may be able to operate in the Western Pacific, but they have fairly shallow magazines. Well, we can't rearm them at sea. And if they've got to come back to Guam for rearming, then they're coming right into the bullseye. Okay, so what's the solution here? Back in the early 1990s, studies in the Office of the Secretary of Defense identified this as a problem. I have quotes from General Fogelman and Admiral Johnson, the service chiefs of the Air Force and the Navy, in the mid-1990s saying this is a problem. And here we are in 2011, and the Air Force and the Navy are still trying to come up with an air-sea battle concept, independent of what Joint Forces Command has done, to try and begin to focus on this problem. We are doing a very poor job of anticipating, and I agree with General Odierno. There's certain things you just can't know, and you're always going to be surprised to some extent, but you shouldn't be surprised by things like this.
Hey, Mr. Chairman, if I could just wrap up from that, I'd just like to make one other comment, please.
Yes, sir.
Thanks very much. Precisely the point I'm hoping to make here in this hearing is that as we complete operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, as we look beyond COIN being really our major focus, that we need to be brutally honest with ourselves in terms of our capability right now to conduct joint forcible entry, lead to early arriving forces, to campaign forces, to sustaining those forces, ultimately to bring victory in what would be probably a low probability but very high risk scenario right now. And this has everything to do with connectivity between how we communicate and how our diplomatic efforts go forward. I want to be clear, in a perfect world, we'll never have to do that. But I think to the extent that we show a capability, if we show a very competent capability to do that, I think that's going to help our country in the out years. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Gibson. Gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Griffin, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General, I've been in the reserve for Army Reserve about 15 years, and I was wondering if you would speak to the reserve component and Guard and how important, if at all, joint training is in that context. I know that for me personally, joint is something you learn about when you get deployed to theater. And I know there have been attempts to address that and sort of change that, but we all know that there are limited resources, there's limited time for reservists, particularly the Guard, and I wonder if you'd just comment on that and what y'all are doing to address that in that context.
There's a couple of things that we do. First off, the way we do operations today is the Guard and the reserves play a critical role, whether it be Iraq, Afghanistan, Japan, even some of the standing joint task force we have prepared for response to a problem inside of the United States. So we now have joint standing task forces that are made up of National Guard and Reserve component. So they are critical to that. They participate in all of the joint staffs and combined staffs that we've established for all the exercise we do. I mean, all the operational missions that we're doing. And they also play a role in all the exercises that we do. We also have in our Joint Warfighting Center, we have reservists and National Guard there who help us to train and sustain this, and that will remain. We've also developed both individual and collective training online that will remain as well in the Deputy Director J7 that will have access to the whole force to include our joint force. So we have the pieces there. It's still about getting individuals, leaders, and others to take advantage of this. It's also about making sure we don't forget about the reserve component and Guard as we move forward. And I think we've worked very hard at this as we have gone forward in many of the operations and training environments that we've established.
Are a lot of these individuals, Guard and Reserve folks, are they AGR? Are they full-time AGR?
It's a combination of all.
TPU and others.
It's a full combination of some are full time, but we also have many AGR and National Guard who come in on a periodic basis.
I am less concerned about you plugging people into your structure, because that's going to be a limited percentage of the Guard and Reserve force. What I'm more concerned about is just culturally incorporating the Guard and Reserve into what's going on with the active duty. I know that there are joint exercises occasionally, but in my real world experience, and I'm still in a TPU, I'm in the process of getting out of it because I have to. But in my experience, truly, jointness is something that a lot of reservists and Guard members on a weekend basis just don't have any dealings with.
I will say that we've had some problems with National Guard and Reserve Component General Officers who have not had the opportunity to serve in joint assignments. And we're trying to address that now and trying to identify them, recognize what they're doing and how we can better incorporate them. So I will tell you, it's not a full solution that we've developed.
It's a challenge.
It's a challenge. And it's also about making sure that we have the leadership of the National Guard, which they do, and the Reserve Component of all the services, understanding the importance of ensuring they do get involved in the joint culture, because it is something that we all are totally involved with. We don't do many large-scale exercises anymore that are not joint. We do very few service-only exercises. And so it's important that we integrate them, because the Guard and Reserves are going to be such an important part of our operational capability as we move forward. As
we move away from the
right.
strategic concept.
That's right.
Admiral, do you have anything to add in my 21 seconds I have left?
Yes, sir. Well, one of our key takeaways is when it comes to employing the Guard and Reserve, we don't want to go back to where we were 10 years ago. And as we're looking to the future, it's how are we going to employ the Guard and Reserve? How can we take those units? How can we train them and employ them, whether they're in exercises, some rotational capacity? And in order to do that, there's got to be training on the front end of that, and that's where we're going to have to focus that joint training.
Thank you all. Appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Griffin. We appreciate all three of you being here today, and I've just got a couple of questions. We'll come back, Madeline, if that's okay. One of the frustrating points that we have as members of Congress, and I don't expect you to comment on this, is that we feel over and over again today from the Department that we are not getting true risk assessments, true strategic analysis, because it's being so budget-driven, that it's more budget-driven than it is by risk assessment. That may be true, it may be false, but it's not just us. The independent panel that was as bipartisan as you can get, no one thought they'd reach consensus. They reached a consensus that that's what they thought, that the QDR even was now being budget-driven as opposed to driven by risk assessments. We have to do the best we can to pull our way through that. And we get wonderful men like you who come over to testify to us, but we know when you walk through those doors, your hands aren't physically tied behind you, but your testimony is, because you have to salute and you have to take what is given to you. And I don't say that critically. I'm just saying we understand that. We don't expect you to do different. But our job here is to try to filter through that the best we can and get the answers we need, because in the final analysis, the job that Ms. Perdello and I have is to make sure when we have a fight anywhere in the world, we don't point fingers, but that our men and women are ready for that fight. Doctor, you talked about Millennium Challenge, but you didn't really give the clear picture, I don't think, of why we left some of those concepts on the floor. You know, you've pointed out to me in conversations before 3 examples: Admiral Yarnell and I think his war game, and the Panzer situation in Germany. And we have a difficult situation, I think, sometimes, because we love to reinforce what we've done as opposed to learn the lessons to predict where we're coming. And I'm going to ask you, if you can, just to elaborate just a little bit on your thought and any potential concerns you have about our inability to continue to look at the experimentation and what we need to be learning from lessons learned and some of the institutional concerns that prohibit us from learning those lessons.
Well, specifically in terms of Joint Forces Command, again, one of the motivating factors behind its creation was to have someone, a four-star commander with sufficient clout, so that the results of these exercises and experiments would get a hearing in terms of establishing requirements. That there would be an interest on the part of the senior defense leadership back in the Pentagon on the results and on what the consequences were and how they might be applied to the defense program and forces and such. There was discussion at the time about giving MFP authority to Joint Forces Command. For some reason, several Joint Forces Command commanders rejected that. But again, that would have given them the opportunity, when you're looking at some of these emerging challenges, to say, if we could prototype this capability, would it make a big difference, or wouldn't it? And again, we see prototyping being an important factor in the past in militaries getting a sense of what they need to be able to do next. The fact that the Commander Joint Forces Command didn't have a seat on the JROC, didn't have a seat on the Defense Acquisition Board, again, really no voice in terms of making recommendations that could really perhaps stick in terms of requirements and program choices and so on. The fact that there was turnover. The commanders typically lasted 2 or 3 years. My sense was if you got someone who was really capable, 2 3-year tours followed by a third tour as Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, because when you're talking about changes in doctrine, you're talking about new kinds of capabilities and systems, it's not a 2 or 3-year problem you have to solve, it's an 8 or a 9 or a 10-year problem. So I think those are some of the things. And then again, the services, they, according to Title X, they're responsible for organized training and equipping the force. And they guard that prerogative jealously. That's their responsibility. They feel like they have the level of expertise inherent in their organization to be able to make the best decisions about ground forces, air forces, naval forces, and so on. And I think they're reluctant to, quite frankly, put a lot of trust in one command that will not only see things the way they do, but see things in the right way. Why is your view better than mine? So there are a number of reasons, I think, why there is difficulty in getting this done. And I also mentioned in the testimony that oftentimes field exercises can be a big help because they can show you what's possible. I mentioned Admiral Pratt after Fleet Problem 9, moving his flag from a battleship to a carrier because he was so impressed by what a carrier could do. By General Halder after the 37 field exercises in Germany. Just was amazed at not the theory, but actually what he could see happening and the reality of that. And it's not just the senior leaders. It's officers at a number of different levels that generate a momentum for this kind of change where it wouldn't exist. It's hard to get people excited about a war game or a simulation. It's much easier to get people excited when they can actually see it happening in reality. So I think that's another particular issue when you're thinking about this particular role for Joint Forces Command. General Odierno said, obviously we haven't seen anything like Millennium Challenge since Millennium Challenge. Understandably, wars on several fronts, tightening budgets, but at the same time, I think if you look at the American military's history and experience, in the 1930s we were doing these things with the fleet problem and so on. We were in the middle of a depression when we did those things. The United States Army in the late 50s and early 60s at the height of the Cold War stood down an entire division to develop the air-mobile air assault concept. In the early 70s, they did it with the TRICAP division. In the 80s, they did it with the high-technology test bed division. So they were willing to take risks in the short term in order to minimize risks in the long term. And I think that approach is important. And the final thing I'll say is we don't seem to do strategy very well. And I think there was kind of an allusion to that in the critique of the QDR. I don't think if you don't do strategy, if you don't take it seriously, and if strategy involves looking down the road as well as what you've got in front of you today, then everything that comes up seems to be priority number one, because you really haven't done that risk analysis to where you're balancing in the near term and the long term risk. And I would say it's not just a military problem. My understanding is it's quite characteristic not only of this administration but the previous administration.
Or administrations. Let me read you a quote from some military papers. It says this: "The building of joint operation systems, Jointness, is the focal point of modernization and preparations for military struggle." Do either of you, the three of you, agree with that statement or disagree with that statement? And if you need me to, let me read it again. Make sure the building of operation systems is the focal point of modernization and preparations for military struggle.
I'll take a first crack at it, I guess. I think what that quote says to me is there are some major strategic choices out there, getting back to the point of strategy. Anti-access area denial. Are we going to counterbalance China in the Western Pacific, or aren't we? What's it going to take to do it? Is that possible technologically? Is it possible fiscally for us to do that? Is it possible if we get some help from our allies? What's it going to take? Or if we can't do it, then that's something the Commander-in-Chief needs to know so he can adapt our overall grand strategy to take that into account. The diffusion of guided weapons into the hands of irregular forces, that's coming. What will a third Lebanon war look like if Hezbollah has, out of its 4,000 projectiles that it might fire into Israel as it did last war, maybe 1,000 that are guided? Space. Are we going to continue to pack stuff in the low Earth orbit, or are we going to emphasize more mission-type orders, commander's intent, terrestrial-based alternative systems? We don't know, but we know we can't invest the same dollar twice. And so there are a number of strategic choices that are in front of us. And the importance of what Joint Forces Command in this area was designed to do was to help us get some of those answers, because only they could bring together a joint force, only they could ideally do an impartial analysis and provide good input into decision makers who are making decisions about strategy and programs and budgets.
Admiral, what's your take on that phrase?
I have a little bit more water in my glass. I don't disagree with any of the challenges, and I agree with almost all of the challenges that the doctor brought out. But at the end of the day, I think we're doing better than most people think we do. And I think we're doing as well as our predecessors did, given the challenges and constraints and restraints that they're confronted with. When it comes to joint training, after 10 years of combat, everybody's found out pretty closely that there's no team sport like combat. And the joint force, no service can go alone, no platoon, no ship, no squadron can do it alone. It's the synergy of the joint force bringing tasks to bear to create the effect that we want to affect on the battlefield. And I think we're doing pretty good work with that. And it's because our predecessors gave us that capability. And our leaders had the vision of Goldwater Nichols to force us to do it, because the services wouldn't have done it on their own, clearly. So what are some of the challenges, though, of that weapon system?
And Admiral, I'm going to let you come back to that, okay. But could we focus just on this statement, and if you would, because this statement basically is saying that jointness is a focal point of modernization and preparations for military struggle. And I want you to say all you want to say. I'm going to give you plenty of time to do that. But do you agree with that statement or disagree with that statement?
Oh, sir, I agree with it, and that's how I opened it up. Jointness is the philosophy that underpins the United States strategic and operational application of the military. That's how I opened up my...
And I appreciate that. And General?
I do agree with it.
Okay, and the reason that I ask that is it's not a trick question. It's That statement is coming from the most recent PLA defense white paper that they put out. So they recognize that. Here's the confusion that I have, not from any of the three of you, but when the Secretary announced the closure of Joint Forces Command, he didn't do it in a venue of saying, we want to do jointness and keep it as a priority. He did it in a venue of saying, we've got to make significant cuts to the military. $100 billion of cuts, basically, at the time. And here's one of the big cuts that we're going to do because we're going to save money. Most of us realize when you start saying you're going to do something better and you're going to save money, oftentimes that comes back to bite you. You get what you pay for. So when the Secretary came out and said, we can now cut this because we are there, help me with what your best understanding is. Was he saying that we've got to make some cost cuts and we're going to do this? Or was he saying we've done the analysis and we think we can do jointness better because it's still going to be a priority for us? Or was he saying we've already accomplished this now and we don't need to put that kind of focus on it?
I'm not going to try to read the mind of the Secretary of Defense, but what I am going to tell you is the conversations I've had with him and where we are now going. What I think his point is that we have made progress in jointness. We're much better at it today than we were 10, 15 years ago. And we believe, he believes, and I believe, it is no longer necessary to have a four-star command to oversee the process of jointness. But I would also say what we found is what had happened to Joint Forces Command over the 10 years is there's many things that were attached to it, added to it, that has absolutely nothing to do with meeting our core mission of sustaining jointness. And so I think what the solution we came to is that we need to eliminate those things that are redundant and done other places, those things that don't really apply to us sustaining our jointness in the future, and let's create something that is more efficient but still enables us to focus on this very important task of jointness, understanding that we've made progress over the last 10 years.
And General, if you would, I think a lot of those additional things were sent down from the Department of Defense to Joint Forces Command. They didn't birth from the Joint Forces Command. They were sent down from the top saying, will you do this? The second thing, though, that concerns me is when we say we no longer need a four-star general to push these concepts and what they're doing. One of the real concerns I have is with the experimentation and what we're doing there. And you and I had a conversation just this morning, and I really respect and appreciate what you said, and I hope it's okay to repeat it, in that you push strongly for the continuation of that experimentation component because you thought it was valuable. Fair statement?
Absolutely fair.
And secondly, that you had to push hard for it because you got some pushback.
There were some elements who didn't agree with it. It was not the Secretary.
No. And this is not a point finger at the Secretary. This is just saying you got some pushback. I think the doctor would say that what you did was very important, that we keep experimentation. Here's my worry. You're a big guy in a lot of ways. You know, not just the stars on your shoulders, but you carry a lot of clout with you, and you had to push hard for that concept. If we had someone that didn't have that kind of clout, I don't know if that day would have been one or not. And I don't know tomorrow if we don't have somebody in there with that kind of clout pushing it. I don't know whether that day's one. Let me just, if I can, then I'm going to give you a chance. The independent panel that came back, not on Joint Forces Command, but on the QDR, basically said exactly that. They said that what happens is now, instead of doing these looks at what we need to do, what we're doing is using it to justify what we're already doing, and that's just a natural bureaucratic tendency to have happen. How are we going to be assured that that's not going to happen with the whole jointness concept, because clearly the message the Secretary gave in his opening volley was, oh, we've kind of reached this point now, and all we have to do is make sure we don't slide back, but we don't have to keep pushing forward.
First, what I would say is, with the way we've set this up for the future, is that we now have a 3-star J7, which in the past it's been a 1-star general, who will focus his full time and effort on overseeing this effort for the chairman and the vice chairman. And what you're really doing is, in my opinion, cutting a level of command that allows this issue to be raised much more quickly, and when there's an issue, be brought directly to the chairman and the vice chairman, who ultimately has the responsibility by Title X for jointness. One of the struggles I see is although I have not had to live it because my time as Joint Forces Command has been different than others, is that he really has very few authorities. The authorities rest with the chairman and the vice chairman and the Joint Chiefs of Staff on making decisions that are key to sustaining jointness over time. What the Joint Forces Command commander was able to do was raise some issues, bring attention to, and I think that's the point you're making. But I would argue today, because of where we come, and because, in fact, we're going to raise the level of expertise on the joint staff on this, I think it'll actually streamline it. And I think it forces the chairman and the vice chairman to make sure they are overseeing this. And as we talk tonight, and I'll say it now, is as we walk through this, the chairman, we all agree that in a year we'll do an analysis of this. And we will continue to do this to make sure we got it right, because we think it's so important that we're able to sustain our ability to move forward with jointness.
Would you mind if I just ask a couple more questions
Absolutely.
on that, General? I'm sorry. Oh, I'll come right back to that. I just want to follow. The concern that you said you thought it was important that we do an analysis in a year or so to make sure we'd made the right decisions because it was so important on the jointness issue. And I think, but I want to just make sure that I was correct, you said that you have done an analysis of that yourself at this particular point in time and think we're moving in the right direction. And I think when I asked you on that too, you said that analysis was because I used the concern of what happens if somebody kidnaps you or take you away, and you said that this would all obviously be done in a written format and that analysis. And I take it when the chairman has this done down the road, the same thing would take place. It would be a written analysis because it was so important to do. Fair?
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak for what the chairman will do, but what I can tell you is we are providing a written analysis of how we came to our conclusion.
But the analysis that should be done in a year would be similar.
We'll use that as a baseline and move forward.
And Admiral shaking his head, yes. Then help me with this. If it is so important, and I agree with you, and that analysis needed to be done by you and that analysis to be done, why wasn't it important that the Secretary do that same kind of analysis before he announced the disestablishment, or as he said at first, the closure of the Joint Forces Command? And the reason I raise it is this, because I think you can appreciate how it does not give quite the same credibility when you come out and say by the Secretary of Defense, we're going to do this, and then say you're tasked to do it, and then come back and give us the analysis that we're doing the right thing. It would have been far more credible for us as a Congress had the Secretary come in and said, let's do an analysis and see if that's the right decision to do first, so that everybody could have analyzed that and looked at that same kind of analysis. Why wasn't that kind of analysis done before the decision was made?
Well, I can't say it wasn't. What I know is I got a guidance letter based on analysis that was given to Joint Forces Command before I got there. So we took the guidance letter that we got from the Office of Secretary of Defense on what they want us to look at, and then we did our own independent analysis based on the guidance letter we received. So I can't discuss about what analysis was
not
done
asking
prior.
you. The only thing I would ask you is this, and you've been very patient with me, but oftentimes we see reports. We've just had some from GAO and other groups that might analyze decisions we've made, whether it's moving carriers or whatever else, and sometimes they disagree by hundreds of billions of dollars. If I'm doing an analysis, it would seem to me to make sense that one of the things I'd want to do is look at the previous analysis that was done and compare my analysis with that and say, did we line up or how far off we were? My question to you is not just a guidance letter, but were you ever presented with the written analysis that was done to substantiate the decision to shut down the Joint Forces Command initially?
My thought was that my impression was that they wanted my independent military opinion based on independent analysis to come forward, and that's what I did.
And General, the last thing I guess I'll ask you is this. When you were sent down to the Joint Forces Command, were your instructions to go down and make an independent analysis and come back and tell us what we should do, or was it to disestablish the Joint Forces Command?
I was required to report back to the Secretary on my findings of the analysis, on what I thought we should do. And I did
shut down the Joint Forces Command.
To take a look at the guidance I had been given, which was based on the announcement that the Secretary did, was to disestablish Joint Forces Command. And he asked me to do an independent analysis. We did that. We presented that back to the Secretary.
But General, again, your instructions, as I understood them, and you correct me if I was wrong, was not to come back and do an independent analysis and let us know what we should do. It was to say how best to shut down and disestablish the Joint Forces Command.
I would say that's correct.
Okay. And the only thing I throw back to you is you understand how that is less credible to us than if the Secretary had said to a very respected general such as yourself, go down there and do an independent analysis and come down and tell us what decision we should make. And the final thing I'll just say, General, is to this date, if that analysis exists prior to August the 9th, when the Secretary made it, he has refused to give it to any member of Congress that I've seen from this committee, the Budget Committee, the Oversight Committee, or the Senate, or anything else. And that, I think, is a huge concern of ours. And but thank you for that, General. Admiral. One quick question for you. When we did BRAC stuff, on here, this committee also has jurisdiction over MILCON projects. When we do a MILCON project, my good friend's overseeing a lot of those in Guam now, there's kind of a start and there is a stop. And at some particular point, we walk in and say, this building's done and it's completed. How is jointness and how is education? Because you mentioned to me both yesterday and today, you said all our young men and women know is jointness because that's what they've been trained to do. But it would seem to me that jointness is never something that we just get done and say, we're done. It seems like it is constantly being trained and taught and built and re-examined and looked at it, and it's an evolving, dynamic thing. Is it more like the MILCON project or more like that education thing that's an ongoing process?
It's a continuum of education, sir, as are most things. And we have put process in place. We have legislated education requirements and experience requirements that service members must achieve in order to promote. And we reinforce that through reporting process. Out of every statutory board, promotion board, the secretary, the chairman has to sign to the secretary joint qualifications, joint educational requirements, things of that nature that mandates that it continue.
And you guys do a wonderful job. You train our young men and women better than any in the world. But you start fresh with every young man and woman that comes in and raises their hands and are sworn in. And my big concern here is this. I'm not expecting you guys to weigh in on it. But I fear when I hear the Secretary say, we've reached jointness, and now we just have to keep from backsliding, that we forget that jointness is that component of rebuilding that, retraining that to every single one of those recruits. And also, like the doctor mentioned, constantly looking at a dynamic, evolving world and how we're going to do the jointness for our allies and for us. And Doctor, I know you had comment earlier, and thanks for your patience with me, and I'll let you do that and then go back to Ms. Berdalla.
I think, at least in terms of the purpose for which Joint Forces Command was established as separate from Atlantic Command, I think it was pretty clear. I don't know that you would really need a rigorous, detailed analysis to know that that mission was not being accomplished. The joint concept development and exercises to the point where you could say we need to continue to justify this as a command. Plus, you had the fact that Atlantic Command had a geographic responsibility. Joint Forces Command no longer had one, nor was the Joint Forces Command commander the supreme commander for Allied command transformation. So I think that's one aspect of it. I mean, having sort of tracked the command since its inception, I don't think it's a hard case to make that in terms of accomplishing that mission after 12 years, this wasn't working. Now, I think we need to find something that works, but clearly it seemed to me that what we had was not working. In terms of, General Ordierno talked about pushback and so on, there's been a lot of pushback over time because a lot of the things that Joint Forces Command was coming up with weren't seen as particularly relevant. And when I talked to one of the commanders a few years ago, the issue came up, we're looking 20 to 30 years out. And I said, in a way, you're kind of wasting your time. Nobody has a clue what's going to happen 20 or 30 years from now. I said, if you look back historically, and I was part of the National Defense Panel conversations, of course, you're looking 5 to 8, maybe 10 years out, and that's what you're really focused on. And in a sense, some of these problems are problems that we know of today that are just going to get worse over time. So so of course, if that's what you think your mission is, and that's what you're providing by way of results, you're not going to satisfy very many people. The concepts they were coming up with were interesting but very abstract, and actually the impetus for them was a memo signed out by Secretary Rumsfeld in August of 2002 that said we need joint integrating and operating concepts to deal with these problems that he had identified in the 2001 QDR, which were not terribly different from the ones that I mentioned here. And unfortunately, in talking to a number of senior military leaders, they just did not feel that they were useful to them. So I think that created a problem. Now, do we have a solution? I don't know. I would say that I'd rather be a combatant commander than a 3-star J7. I think they have more clout. I think they have more influence. I think they have more access. I could be wrong. I do know that in 1999, when Secretary Cohen and General Shelton were approached by members of Congress about establishing a Joint Forces Command because they took the National Defense Panel report, they did say that periodically we would revisit the command and see how well it's doing and make adaptations, so that at least that's on the table. My sense is I think that if you look at what the command has done well, in a sense there's kind of 3 missions. One is what some of us in the military in the past have called polishing the cannonball, to get more efficient at what you're already doing. And I think, based on my experience, I think the command has done that pretty darn well. Second is reactive transformation. If the mission was transformation, I think, as General Ordierno said, and he should know better than just about anybody, the command provided a significant amount of utility when we were faced with modern insurgency or irregular warfare in terms of helping us begin to deal with that, react to that, and become very proficient at it. I think the area where we've consistently come up short is what I would call anticipatory transformation, getting out in front of the next problem. And I don't see necessarily how that's going to change given what we have here in terms of the disestablishment of Joint Forces Command. It's not self-evident to me that what we've got in its place is going to accomplish that mission.
Good. Ms. Berdalla?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And my first question is for you, Dr. Krepenovich. I want to thank you for mentioning Guam. And just to let you know, and the rest of the world, that we are still afloat. To be clear, Doctor, China does not have a missile that can reach Guam yet, although it's been talked about. Is that correct?
I'm not sure about the specific ranges. And of course, a number of those are classified in terms of what we get from our intelligence community. I do know that beginning in the mid-1990s, they were focused intently in building missiles that could range Taiwan. And then in my conversations with my Japanese colleagues in recent years, they said, well, they've moved beyond that. They've really begun to emphasize hitting us now with medium range and intermediate range ballistic missiles. I've had classified briefings that would suggest that the overall trend, I think I can say this, is toward increasing range, number one. It's been reported in the open literature that they're developing the DF-21, which is designed to be a maneuverable warhead to go after our carriers. And then, of course, you have the issue of their submarine fleet, which, although it, in terms of technical capacity, isn't that great, the potential for anti-ship cruise missiles and cruise missiles that can be used, especially if you get to shoot first in a conflict, you can at least expend those munitions. And then building certain capacity in terms of their air force and so on. So I would say that depending upon the contingency you're looking at right now, we're lesser or better able to prepare to deal with it. Based on my understanding of what's in the open literature, open source literature right now, obviously the Taiwan situation is not as we don't have as it's a higher risk proposition.
That's correct.
And if you look at if you look at two things, if you look at where we're basing our forces in Kadena and in Anderson, when I was a kid, I'd watch these westerns. And there was always some second lieutenant leading the wagon train, usually Ricky Nelson or Fabian or somebody, who wanted to take them through the canyon, and somebody like John Wayne would say, don't do it, that's where all the Indians are. Well, in a sense, these big bases are the canyons. I mean, if they know you've got to go through there, if they know that's where you're going to be, you've given them an incredible incentive to target those. Again, we see the Chinese moving exactly in that direction. In terms of investments, and I was very glad to see Secretary Gates make the announcement recently that they are going to move forward with a family of long-range strike systems, because up until now, our investment ratio has been over 15-to-1 short range versus long range. So
that was one of the things, Doctor, I was going to talk to you, because further, when we talk anti-access, shouldn't we view this through a prism of full spectrum operations like the long range strike?
Oh, absolutely. Our center has developed our version of the air-sea battle concept. Since right now it's the only game in town, we've gotten a lot of visits both from the Chinese embassy and the Japanese embassy, and I was scheduled to meet with the Chief of Staff of the Japanese Air Force. Unfortunately, the earthquake precluded that. But the idea behind that is you have an integrated set of capabilities. Again, this is why exercises at the tactical level and training at the tactical level makes sense. But unless you put it within an overall operational context of what you're trying to do as part of a campaign, you're really not capturing all you need to do. And so, for example, in our concept, we realized that, at least the way we look at the situation, number one, things like range become very important, submarines become very important, anti-satellite capability becomes very important, cyber. We're able to sit down with the Japanese and say, look, we need your vote in the UN, we need your bases, but here's what we need in terms of your military capability. And we actually ended up doing planning exercises with the Japanese government, and they are waiting. They are waiting for our Air Force and our Navy to publish air-sea battle, and they've been waiting since Secretary Gates gave them the directive over a year ago.
Well, thank you, Doctor. Both the chairman and I have been through numerous briefings and CODELs over to China, and there's not much you can learn. You know, they're very secretive, but I know that they're developing missiles at a fast pace.
If you read their military publications, first of all, they're very unambiguous that way. There are slogans like, and this is repetitive, we need capabilities that will enable the inferior to defeat the superior. We're weak, but we're not weak in all things. The Americans are strong, but they're not strong in all things. We need to align Eastern wisdom and Western technology to defeat the Americans. I mean, if we were publishing stuff like this about the Chinese, there would be a great hoo-ha.
Well, there'd probably be another war.
Quite frankly, the shift clearly is one to move the military balance in their favor. We used to have a term for it in the Cold War called Finlandization. To gradually shift the military balance to where your allies start to become detached from you because they lose confidence in you. And their big emphasis is on this anti-access area denial capability and fracturing our battle networks. And so one big question, in fact, General Mattis and I, when the predecessor to General Odierno, used to have this conversation about, okay, what happens if, are we training sufficiently enough and rigorously enough and at the operational level in situations where we lose access to the battle network? And General Odierno and I were commissioned around the same time. Obviously, he's gone a little bit further than I did. But one of the things that would happen in a lot of field exercises was the evaluator would come in and say, buddy, you just lost your comms. And you'd have to figure out, okay, well, how do I operate effectively now? And those are the sorts of things that we need to be doing. And it's not just at the individual unit level. It's with a campaign perspective. And the talent is out there, and the frustration, at least for me individually, is why haven't we been able to harness this great talent, the great professionalism of our military to begin to come up with at least some answers to these questions?
Thank you, Doctor. I do have just one last question, Mr. Chairman. Please bear with me. For the Admiral and possibly the General as well, I've heard that nearly every combatant commander come and testify that they are trying to build a whole-of-government approach to operations in their areas of responsibility. And some have mentioned strategic endeavors to foster broader public-private partnerships between the military and commercial industries. Now, my question for you is, how does the Joint Staff foster this partnering ideology? And what is the Joint Staff doing to build broader intercoordination among our forces around the world and our future allies or partners? And Admiral, start with you.
If there's another lesson learned from 10 years of combat, it's the whole-of-government approach and how much it's needed. It's a key tenet of what we want to do, what we want to continue to do, what we want to continue to train to. And one of the synergies of aligning joint force development underneath the J7 for the chairman is that the interagency lives here in D.C. We can exercise here in D.C. We have the conferences here in Washington, D.C. It really provides that opportunity to ensure that we do it right in the future.
General?
I don't want to go too long of an answer on this, but this is one that I think about and talk about quite often. We watch it, or we're watching it in front of our eyes today, the globalization, which is allowing many different communities to understand what's going around the world very quickly, the change in populations, the change in power as we see it shifting in front of us requires us to engage along several different levels. We've learned over the last 10 years that sometimes there's a limit to military power, and you have to use many other capabilities in order to achieve your end states and your results. And I think what the combatant commanders are talking about is they must have the capabilities to go out there on many different ways in coordination with our interagency partners, as well as make bilateral connections, our mill-to-mill connections with all these different countries around the world for us to better understand the environment that we have to operate in and how we might solve problems in many different ways, just not always with military power, but in conjunction with our capabilities within our military. And I think that's one of the key components of our training of our young joint officers today is them understanding the environment around them, then able to think about these complex environment they're about ready to enter, and how they can come up with the right solutions working across the broad spectrum. And I think as we continue to have budget issues and budget problems and potential reductions and other things, we have to come up with adaptive, alternative ways to solve problems. And I think that's why they believe they have to continue to do this. So I think it's something we have to pay attention to. It's something we have to focus on as we move forward. We talked about anti-access. Part of that is attacking that across many different ways, having military capability to do, but also how do we gain access? The global commons we used to always think of as air, land, and sea. It's now air, land, sea, space. I personally would add cyberspace. So how do we assure our own access to the global commons as we look forward around the world? And those are the issues that are very difficult. And that's why we have to attack it in many different new ways, ma'am.
Well, I would say that the military buildup that's occurring right now on Guam, and of course this is a partnership between Guam and Japan, this would be a shining example of how we're going to be able to go forward. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much.
General, any final comments you have or questions that we didn't ask that you wanted to get on the record?
The only thing I would say is I want to again thank you for holding this hearing. I think it's a very important one, and the discussion we had is one that we have to constantly have as we look ahead to the future and how we're going to sustain ourselves in this very complex environment. So I just want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this committee meeting today.
Thank you, General, and thank you for being here. Admiral, any final thoughts that you have?
Yes, sir. I just want to make sure there's no doubt in anybody's mind that through this process, we're not challenging or walking away from Goldwater Nichols and the importance of joint force development. Remember that Goldwater Nichols predates JIFCOM by 13 years. Instead, we're finding a better way to perform that joint oversight and ensuring joint readiness in the future.
Thank you, Admiral. Doctor, any final comments?
Just to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to be here and express my views today, and also to have the opportunity to publicly express my admiration and appreciation for, in particular, General Odierno and his great service to our country, but also to the Admiral and the little army that he brought along today. It's having served in the military once upon a time myself, I can't but imagine how challenging and how difficult it's been for these young men and women and how remarkable a job they've done under these difficult circumstances. Thank you.
Thank you all for being with us. We appreciate your patience and your service to the country. We're adjourned.